Ancient Egypt. For millennium, it has captured the imaginations, hearts, and minds of generations of truth seekers, eager to know who really built the pyramids, when they were built, and why they were built.
This documentary series is comprehensive. It's the biggest documentary series ever made about ancient Egypt. This documentary series will not only rewrite the history of ancient Egypt, it will turn the history of the human race upside down. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Ever since I was a child, I had a fascination with ancient Egypt. Any book, any documentary, I watched it, I read everything. But every time I saw it or I read it, something about what the Egyptologists were telling me didn't ring true. And for years and years and years, like a big jigsaw puzzle, I tried to put the pieces together. And I tried to put them together the way the Egyptologists had them. But the picture didn't make sense. And then I came to Egypt and I saw the evidence for myself. And the picture started to take a different shape. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Most people are aware of the three great pyramids at Giza, but the reality is there are over 100 pyramids currently known to exist in Egypt, many of them in poor states of disrepair or almost unrecognizable piles of rubble. In this episode, we will continue our examination of the history of ancient Egypt. In particular, we shall examine the 5th dynasty and review what we've been told about it and the pyramids and other structures supposedly built by its pharaohs. Were these pyramids actually built when the Egyptologists say they were? And were they built as tombs for kings and queens? Or do they symbolize something else, such as a map of the stars in the night sky? And what lays awaiting deep beneath the ground? Is it the answer, or part of the answer, to the true history of Egypt? And will the answers to those questions pose even more questions? Are there more pyramids and ancient temples, like the secrets of ancient Egypt, yet to be discovered, buried, waiting to be revealed? Join me as we explore all that and lots more as we continue our exploration of what has been referred to as the Age of the Pyramids, and we take a look at the 5th dynasty. The division between the 4th and 5th dynasties was not just marked by Shepseskaf simply being succeeded by his son, Userkaf. It is reflected in the actual changes taking place in Egypt's religion and in the king's role at that time. In particular, the sun god Ra's prominence over the rest of the Egyptian gods and the increased royal devotion given to him. That made Ra a sort of a state god.
It was Nebra, or Ar-Neb, in the 2nd dynasty, who had first associated himself with the god Ra, then Sneferu in the 4th dynasty who first associated himself with the solar cult of that god. But it was Djedefer, ruling just after Sneferu in the 4th dynasty, who reduced the status of the king from a living god to the son of that god, writing one of the components of a king's royal titulary, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt part, inside a cartouche, signifying that the king ruled over everything that the sun's disk, or Ra, encircled. The use of the cartouche became the norm in the 5th dynasty when kings adopted the title Son of Ra, and the fifth dynasty is thus known as the dynasty of the Sun Kings because the names of so many rulers have the god Ra's name in them, usually given as Re.
As a consequence, although the king was the representation of the gods on earth and commanded respect,
the sun god Ra was now worshipped directly by the people through the offices of the priesthood, and the king's role as direct representative of the god was diminished.
Thus, through the fifth dynasty, the true power of the people slowly drifted away from the king and into the hands of the priests.
The fifth dynasty begins with Userkaf, whose reign heralded the ascendancy of the cult of Ra. Prior to ascending the throne, Userkaf may even have been a high priest of Ra in Heliopolis or Sakabu, a cult center of Ra mentioned in the Westcar papyrus.
It is also highly likely that he commenced his reign with his great uncle, Sekhemkare, a son of Khafre, already in the office as vizier.
The identity of Userkaf's parents is not known for certain, but some Egyptologists propose that he was a son of Menkaure by one of his minor queens, most likely Shepsiskaf, and was thus possibly a full brother to his predecessor Shepsiskaf, the last king of the fourth dynasty, although the majority of Egyptologists contend he was the son of Shepsiskaf and Khentkhaz I. The identity of his queen is also in doubt, although it is believed he married Neferhetepes II, who may possibly have been the daughter of Khentkhaz and Jud-Ef-Ptah, and thus a half-sister. Userkaf had at least one daughter, Karmahat, her inscription uncovered in the mastaba of Ptah Shepsis, and very probably a son, Saru-Re, who succeeded him as pharaoh.
I think that as Ptah Shepsis and Shepsiskaf both studied as priests together, it is more than likely Karmat was Ptah Shepsis' wife and Shepsiskaf's daughter. Also, as to Sahura being Userkaf's son, while it's likely, we should also keep in mind that Sahura could alternatively be Userkaf's younger brother. Given they intermarried with daughters, sisters and aunts, and had multiple wives, unless definitive evidence is discovered, it could be any or all of the above.
Several fragmentary statues of Userkaf have been uncovered, including a bust carved from grey-wacke stone found in his sun temple at Abu Sir, the head 45 cm high and showing the king wearing the Desh-Ret headdress of Lower Egypt.
How do we know that this is Userkaf? We don't. It's an assumption based on where it was found. That would be like me digging up a bust of Socrates in Donald Trump's backyard and thus assuming the bust was Donald Trump. The Sun Temple at Abu Sir may not even originally have been built by Userkaf. He may simply have made additions to a pre-existing structure. We just don't know for sure. And this statue was made of grey-wacke, not limestone or alabaster, which was the usual stone of choice at the time. Why? And how did the bust get damaged? Perhaps it belongs to someone from a much earlier period. Perhaps even before the Great Flood, or the Zep Tepi, or even earlier.
Another head which might belong to Userkaf, wearing the hedjet of Upper Egypt and made of painted limestone, has also been discovered.
Okay, so here we have a head, carved out of limestone. It seems contemporary with the other, but it has a different headdress. Is it Userkaf? It's just a guess.
The head of a colossal larger-than-life statue of Userkaf was found in the temple courtyard of his mortuary complex at Saqqara in 1928. This colossal head of pink as-1 granite shows the king wearing the Nemes headdress with a cobra on his forehead. Other than the head of the Great Sphinx, this is the largest surviving head dating to the Old Kingdom, and the only colossal royal statue from this period.
So, is there any proof this red granite colossus is actually Userkaf? No, there's no evidence at all, not a scrap. A colossal red granite statue, a Nemes headdress, a cobra on the forehead, compare that to a limestone head with a headjet headdress. Isn't it highly possible that they are different people from totally different eras? And or that the limestone statue is a much later copy of the earlier style? It's possible.
Many more fragments of statues of the king made of diorite and granite have been found at the same site.
Saqqara is an old site. I mean, it was 600 years old at least by the time Userkaf reigned. Probably much older, possibly tens of thousands of years older. What if the statue was created then? We just don't know.
The annals of the Old Kingdom record offerings Userkaf gave to the gods of Heliopolis, the gods of Buto, and a donation of land to Horus to build a temple in his name, though we are not aware of its location. The annals also record other offerings which correspond to other building projects, including the Temple of Montu at El Tad, 20 kilometers southwest of Luxor in Upper Egypt, where Userkaf is the earliest attested pharaoh. However, due to later structural alterations, in particular during the early Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and Ptolemaic periods, little of Userkaf's original small mud brick chapel has survived. Of note, a granite pillar inscribed with Userkaf's name.
A small granite pillar. 1. Pillars usually hold up ceilings or porticos, and there are usually several pillars at least. And yet here we have one pillar in a chapel made of mud brick. That doesn't add up. The two building materials are not contemporary, aesthetically, technically, or practically, unless the pillar belonged to a much earlier civilization, and Userkaf simply reused it and put his name on it.
Beyond the borders of Egypt, Userkaf may have launched a military expedition into Nubia and led a military expedition to Canaan or the Eastern Desert, returning with a workforce of 1 chieftain and 70 foreigners, most likely women, as well as 303 pacified rebels, most likely exiled due to conflicting support for another challenging ruler at the end of the 4th dynasty. It also appears from a series of reliefs from his mortuary temple of ships engaged in what may be a naval expedition, and a stone vessel bearing the name of his sun temple that was uncovered on the Greek island of Kythera, that trade contacts with the Greeks seem to have existed at the time, but, other than that, little is known of Userkaf's activities beyond the construction of his pyramid and sun temple.
That's if he actually did construct them. We have to take a look at the evidence.
Because their names have been found written in contemporary papyrus documents, there is believed to have originally been 6 pharaohs of the 5th dynasty who built temples to the Heliopolitan sun god Re, though only 2 have been discovered, the solar temples of Userkaf and Nusra, prompting some Egyptologists to speculate that the other 4 lost temples may never have existed, rather, that Userkaf and Nusra usurped them, adding and building on the 2 known temples.
Finally, some common sense. But did the experts take it any further? That if the pharaohs usurped the sun temples, isn't it possible, even probable, they usurped other structures like the mortuary temples, even the pyramids as well? It seems they didn't. So why not? Were they conditioned and locked into their beliefs concerning the dating of the constructions of the pyramids? It would seem that that's the only plausible explanation. And that then raises the question of the 2 sun temples themselves.
In some respects, the sun temples resemble pyramid complexes in that they have a valley temple on the edge of the desert, a causeway leading from it, and leading to a temple erected on a hill. However, though both the sun temples and mortuary temples are oriented east-west, the design of the sun temple differs completely from the mortuary temples associated with the pyramids, and the exact purpose and function of the sun temples is not known.
So, what was the function of the sun temple that was different to the function of a mortuary temple that it required the building of another temple? Yes, I know, one worships the sun while the other worships the dead pharaoh. But I'm not buying that. The pharaoh was a living god. He was the representation of the sun god Ra, so there has to be more to it. Let's have a look at the evidence.
Yusukov is best known for the construction of the first temple of the sun, known as the Nekimre, on a 20-meter high promontory at the edge of the desert at Abu Ghurab.
Although at the time it was built, it may well have not been a desert, because Yusukov may well have been the first to usurp a pre-existing structure and turn it into a sun temple.
Variously translated as the Fortress of Ra, the Stronghold of Ra, the Residence of Ra, Ra's Storms, and the Birthplace of Ra, Yusukov's choice of Abu Sir as the site of his sun temple has not been satisfactorily explained, the site being of no particular significance up to that point.
There were no inscriptions found giving clues as to its original purpose or the choice of its location. Maybe the reason for the location was otherworldly, which we shall get to in due course.
Today, the temple is in ruin, blocks of granite and limestone strewn all over the place, with only a few fragmentary architectural elements of the temple remaining, including parts of a short granite obelisk which would have been placed on a pedestal building in the center of the temple. Despite this, the general outline of the temple is still discernible. The Temple of the Sun essentially functioned as a mortuary temple for the setting sun, rites performed in the temple primarily concerned with both Ra's creator function and as his role as father of the king. By the end of Yusukov's rule, the Sun Temple seems to have simply comprised a rectangular enclosure wall with a high mast set on a mound in its center.
That sounds to me like a simple sundial. Or maybe there's more to it. According to our star map, this temple is a sun, possibly Aldebaran, in the Pleiades, in the constellation of Taurus. How is that important? We will look at how significant the location actually was and what the real function of the temple may have been when we get to Abu Sir in a later episode. And I can assure you that will raise more questions than it can possibly give answers.
To the east of this mound was a mud brick altar with statue shrines on both sides of it. The temple did not yet house the large granite obelisk on a pedestal that it would subsequently acquire.
Mud brick altars? These building materials were very basic. Red granite is far from basic. Just the effort needed to extract it from a quarry is exhaustive at best. And just when the red granite obelisk arrived and from where is anyone's guess. Maybe it was part of a pre-existing structure that was destroyed by a tsunami and dug up nearby. And Yusukov and his successors were attempting to rebuild the structure. Who knows for sure?
Archaeologists believe the upper temple was probably built in 4 stages, originally just a low mound of mud brick, resembling a mastaba, built within an enclosure wall. Then Yusukov's son, Nefer-ir-Kare, replaced the temple's original central mound with a 70-meter granite obelisk, with the additions by later kings Nefer-Hefre and Nusra.
Sorry, the use of red granite just doesn't add up. Not during the reign of Nefer-ir-Kare, not even in the 5th dynasty. The granite must have either been part of the original structure, which included a foundation mound, or been used to reconstruct the structure. And my thinking is that it was part of a pre-existing, pre-dynastic structure on the site.
In Phase 3, dating to the reign of Nusra, the enclosure and the area around the obelisk were completely rebuilt, with the addition of an inner enclosure wall and several new chambers of limestone.
Rebuilt after what?
Phase 4 consisted of the exterior surfaces covered in plastered mud brick and the addition of some annex buildings against the southeast corner, thus giving the temple its final shape. There was also the addition of a mud brick altar to the east side of the pedestal, surrounded by a curiously diminutive enclosure wall, and, further east, 5 benches, or low tables made of mud and broken stone for priests.
Lots of mud brick, hardly indicative of the grandeur or the technical knowledge required when using red granite.
During excavations, a beautiful schist head belonging to a statue of Userkaf and wearing the red crown was found here.
Was this one piece of evidence why they described the temple to Userkaf? Because they found a bust in the rubble? It accentuates the Egyptologists' predisposition and conditioning to ascribe the ownership of a site to the earliest cataloguable evidence they find, totally discounting it could have been built before then, and that the statue was a later addition. Did they even consider that the advanced civilization that built these granite structures had no need to claim them, no need to scratch their name into the rock like primitive cavemen?
The Valley Temple, once located on the shores of the Nile, is badly destroyed.
But by what? A catastrophic flood? But from which direction?
A plan was reconstructed from fragments, suggesting the Valley Temple was quite an elaborate structure that may have served multiple purposes, and included an open courtyard surrounded by a 16-pillared portico, with at least 5 niches or chapels at the rear. There may also have been an entrance hall with annexes, but the damage is so extensive that this part of the temple cannot be determined.
If the columns were made of granite, then surely it dates the site as pre-dynastic.
The temple was surrounded on the sides and back by an enclosure wall that opened on its southwest corner into the causeway, aligned southwest and divided into 3 lanes along its length by low mud brick walls, the widest lane in the center while the 2 outside lanes were narrow.
Maybe one side channel took water up, the other waste down, and the central corridor was for commuting between the 2 temples. But mud brick? That doesn't sound particularly advanced to me. I think we shall leave a more in-depth analysis of the Temple of the Sun until we get to Abusir later in the series.
During his lifetime, the king would appoint his closest family members to be officials of the running of the temple, allowing them to benefit from the temple's income and thus ensuring their loyalty. Userkaf also built a pyramid in Saqqara, originally with a base of 73 meters, a slope of 53 degrees, and rising 49 meters high. Userkaf's pyramid was built to the northeast of that of Necht-Jerekat, in such a location that forced architects to put the associated mortuary temple in an unusual position to the south of the pyramid.
Or the pyramid was already there, and they had very little choice as to where the temple could be built.
The pyramid was built following techniques established during the 4th dynasty, with a core of small roughly hewn blocks of local limestone set in horizontal layers in a step-like structure rather than employing rubble as in subsequent pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties. This meant a considerable saving of labor compared to the large and more accurately hewn stone cores created using the accretion layer method of 4th dynasty pyramids.
I've already disputed the dates of the earlier pyramids in the previous 2 episodes. So was this pyramid, like all the others, from an earlier time, with the ones built from rubble indeed subsequent attempts to repair or reconstruct damaged structures? We shall see.
The outer casing of the pyramid was made of fine white Torah limestone.
This is the pyramid of Usa at Saqqara. These are some of the casing stones made of limestone. And you can see the extent of the erosion going along here. Now the Egyptologists, they say this is caused by wind and sand. Well, if that were true, why isn't this part eroded? Why aren't other parts of the casing eroded? Logic tells you that this is water flowing along at this level but not up higher, and it's causing an extent of erosion that's quite dramatic. Not over a long period of time, but very quickly. There's clues everywhere as to what's really gone on in Egypt. All we have to do is just look at it with different eyes, not with the prejudices and the biases and the conditioning of the early Egyptologists.
The core was so poorly laid out that once the pyramid's outer casing of fine limestone had been robbed, it crumbled into a heap of rubble.
Robbed or washed away by a huge surging torrent of water. And was this simpler method of construction actually an indication this pyramid was an earlier model, meaning it predated the accretion method structures? Or was it an indication of a much later repair? Given the pyramids were not originally built by any dynastic rulers, it is a distinct possibility. But would that be reflected in the subterranean chambers?
The entrance to the pyramid is from the north and would have been through the pavement of the pyramid's northern courtyard if it hadn't been for the fact an earthquake in 1991 had buried it beneath rubble.
So earthquakes here clearly have a major structural effect.
The superstructure of the pyramid itself does not have internal chambers, rather they are located underground, constructed in a deep open ditch dug before the pyramid construction started and only later covered by the pyramid.
That sounds very similar to the pyramids at Abu Ruwash and Zayet El Aryan. Is this evidence the subterranean structures were all built at one time, and the superstructures, the pyramids themselves, a much later addition? If so, why?
The entrance was hewn into the bedrock and floored and roofed with large slabs of white limestone, most of which have been removed in modern times. It descends 18.5 meters southward to a horizontal tunnel 8 meters below the pyramid base, the first few meters of this tunnel roofed and floored with red granite, the tunnel eventually blocked by two large portcullis of red granite, the first one still having traces of the gypsum plaster used to seal the portcullis.
There's that red granite again. But this time, not just for the portcullises, it's also for the ceiling and the floor. But what's more curious are the traces of gypsum used to seal the portcullis. If the granite portcullis was a physical block to prevent entry by tomb robbers, then there would be no point sealing the block, as tomb robbers could just chip the gypsum away. If, however, at a later time you needed to air seal the portcullis, perhaps as an attempted repair, then that would make sense. But why would you need to make the structure airtight? More on that when we get to Saqqara later in the series.
Adjoining the eastern side of Userkef's pyramid are what remains of a small offering chapel. Barely visible, the chapel consisted of a central two-pillared room with a large quartzite false door and two narrow chambers to either side. Its walls were made of Torah limestone, adorned with fine reliefs of offering scenes, with granite dados decorated with scenes of sacrifice gracing the upper sections of the other walls, and it had a floor of black basalt.
It may well have been usurped by Userkaf as an offering chapel, but was that its original function? Why just use red granite for the lower part of the walls? Was it structural, decorative, or was there some sort of functional reason? And where does the basalt fit in? Perhaps we'll find out later in the series, once we've had a look at all of the evidence.
The accompanying temple, located on the southern side rather than the usual eastern one, is much smaller than those built during the 4th dynasty, and was most likely built to the south because there was insufficient room to the east due to the presence of a large trench surrounding Netjeriket's pyramid and running to the east.
Was it a trench? A moat? Or was the whole area a harbour? And alternatively, Userkaf's choice for the temple location on the pyramid's southern side may be simply because it could have ensured the temple's year-round exposure to the sun. In any case, it's strong evidence that the location of the pyramid was determined way before any associated temples were even planned, meaning the mortuary temple couldn't be contemporary with the pyramid, and any reference to the builder of the temple was just that, to the temple, but not to the pyramid.
It is almost impossible to make out any detail of the temple because, during the 26th dynasty, a large shaft tomb was built in its midst, and all that remains are sections of the basalt paving in what was the courtyard and the large granite blocks framing the outer door.
Again, why the basalt paving and the granite door jambs? Do they date to a much earlier structure? And could the damage also be attributable to the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty? Surely it can. So why did they dig a huge hole right here during the 26th dynasty? A shaft tomb? I don't think so. Maybe it was used for that later on. But what were they looking for? What were they trying to retrieve from beneath the surface?
The entrance to the temple, from the causeway leading from Yusukof's Valley Temple, which remains unexplored and unexcavated, was at the southeast corner. Inside the entrance, the corridor takes a right then left turn before arriving at the pillared courtyard, paved in basalt and surrounded on all sides except the south by monolithic pink granite pillars inscribed with Yusukof's name and titles.
But just because Yusukof's cartouche is inscribed into them doesn't mean he built the temple. Yusukof may have just usurped them.
Yusukof was the first pharaoh to introduce highly detailed nature scenes in his funerary complex, the walls lavishly and extensively adorned with numerous fine-painted raised reliefs of exceptional quality, including scenes of life in a papyrus thicket, a boat with its crew, the names of Upper and Lower Egyptian estates connected to the cult of the king, and one single relief showing no less than 7 different species of birds and a butterfly. He also included scenes of hunting in the marshes, symbolizing the victory of the king over the forces of chaos that would become common in subsequent times.
But what if these weren't funerary temples at all? What if they were administrative temples that collected offerings for the living king? The temple may well have been built by Yusukof, but not necessarily the pyramid. We'll have a closer look later in the series when we get to Saqqara.
Near the south wall once stood a 5-meter-high colossal statue of Yusukof, the head of which is now in the Cairo Museum and shows him wearing the Nemes headdress with a cobra on his forehead.
Is this the evidence that Egyptologists rely on to attribute the pyramid to Yusukof? The reliefs and a statue? If it is, it's pretty scant. The statue, assuming it really is of Yusukof and not appropriated by him, could have been placed there at any time. Similarly, the pink granite pillars in the courtyard could also have been appropriated by Yusukof from an earlier temple. But the sheer size of the statue and the fact it's made of red granite, as are the pillars, it seems telling, and whilst the evidence may indicate the temple was most likely built or appropriated by Yusukof, it doesn't confirm that Yusukof was responsible for building the pyramid. In fact, the position of the temple seems to totally prove that the pyramid was in place well before the temple was even planned.
2 doors, one each at the southeast and southwest corners of the courtyard, led to a small hypostyle hall, the inner sanctum, with 4 pairs of red granite pillars and a chapel with 3 to 5 niches where cult statues of Yusukof were placed.
Even more red granite. If it's as worn as the red granite columns on Elephantine Island, then it clearly predates the surrounding stone by thousands of years.
What is interesting is that whilst the inner sanctum was located on the south side of the courtyard, separating it from the pyramid, the offering hall, that logically should follow, is not located in the inner sanctum, but rather exists as the small, separate chapel in front of the pyramid's east wall.
What was that again? Because they ran out of room. Because, like the main pyramid, the satellite pyramid was already there and had been for centuries. It makes a lot of sense that something was in the way. It's as if the mortuary temple had been chopped up and shuffled around to fit in the space between the pre-existing pyramids. And that can mean only one thing. They weren't planned or built by the same person or in the same period.
The smaller pyramid, 10 meters to the south, strongly suggests it was built for one of his queens, most likely Neferhetepes, the mother of Yusuf's successor and likely son, Saru-Re.
Wow! How do you get all that from just one pyramid being next to another pyramid? Quite simply, the Egyptologists have a belief, or a series of beliefs, be they correct or erroneous, and they mould and speculate random facts to make them support their beliefs. That, my dear viewers, is not scientific process, that is wishful thinking.
Now little more than a small mound of rubble, the pyramid has a base of 26.25 meters and, with a slope of 52 degrees, would originally have stood around 16.8 meters high. It is similar to that of Yusuf's in that its core is built with the same technique of 3 horizontal layers of roughly hewn local limestone blocks and gypsum mortar, the core once covered with an outer casing of fine Torah limestone, now gone, the pyramid having been extensively used as a stone quarry.
But what if the casing stones weren't harvested? I mean, people just don't go off and hack chunks of pre-existing sacred structures. Surely something had destroyed the pyramid first, and the tsunami fits the bill perfectly. What if they weren't harvested? Yes, some may have been, but what if they were washed away by the effects of a massive tsunami tens of thousands of years earlier? And how do we know it was built for Neferhetepes? Was her body found there? No. Was anything found in there confirming the pyramid was actually built for her, or for anyone for that matter? No. It's pure speculation.
The internal chambers of the Queen's Pyramid, a scaled-down version of those in Yusuf's main pyramid, are exposed, the entrance to the substructure consisting of a descending passage leading to a T-shaped chamber, with a gabled roof made of large limestone blocks, located under the tip of the pyramid and oriented on an east-west axis.
Okay, that confirms it for me, that the gabled ceilings are not there to relieve the weight of the pyramid from the chamber. This is only a small pyramid, and I can't see the purpose of using such a unique structural device in such a small pyramid if it was to do with weight distribution. These gabled ceilings surely have a functionality, and that functionality is not to relieve the pressure of the weight of the stones pressing down onto the chamber. But what was the functionality?
From the ruins, archaeologists propose that the Queen's Pyramid once had its own mortuary temple, to the eastern side, comprising an open colonnade, possibly made of granite, a sacrificial chapel adjoining the pyramid side, 3 statue niches, and a few magazine chambers.
I'm not prepared to accept a granite colonnade existed unless there's actual evidence. How they can deduce all of that from a pile of sand and rubble is beyond me. It's not based on the evidence. It's speculation based on conditioned belief.
The final structure of the funerary complex, occupying the southwest corner, are the lowest 2 levels of the core of another, smaller, satellite pyramid, originally standing 15 meters high, with a base of 21 meters, and with a slope of 53 degrees, identical to that of the main pyramid.
But the Egyptologists don't consider this a Queen's Pyramid. Why not? Perhaps because none of them ever were.
The core was made of roughly hewn limestone blocks disposed in 2 layers and finally clad with fine Torah limestone. Entered from the north, a descending corridor leads just below ground level to a T-shaped chamber, with a gabled roof, constructed in a shallow open pit dug into the ground before the construction of the pyramid above it commenced.
And that's consistent with many of the pyramids. But the question remains as to how long after the subterranean chamber was built was the superstructure erected over it, and why? We'll explore that later in the series.
The exact duration of Yusukuf's reign is not known. Mani, though, says he reigned for 28 years. However, given the historical and archaeological evidence, including an analysis of the Old Kingdom royal annals, a mason's inscription found on a stone of Yusukuf's Sun Temple, and the Turin royal canon, the consensus among Egyptologists is that he ruled for 7 to 8 years. After Yusukuf's death, like other 4th and 5th dynasty kings, Yusukuf was the object of a funerary cult. However, though his cult flourished in the early to mid 5th dynasty, Yusukuf was succeeded by his son, Saru-Re, meaning he who is close to Re, who must have assumed the throne at a young age following the death of his father. Although many Egyptologists initially erroneously believed Saru-Re was Yusukuf's brother.
That misconception was corrected in 2005 when a relief was discovered that originally adorned the causeway of Sahure's pyramid, showing Sahure seated in front of his 2 sons, Ranifer and Netjererenre.
Next to Ra-Nefer's name, the text Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, had been added, indicating that Ra-Nefer was Saru-Re's son and that he had assumed the throne under the name Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai at the death of his father.
However, both Ranifer and Netjererenre are given the title of king's eldest son, so it has been speculated that they may have been twins, with Ranifer born first.
The same relief further depicts Queen Merodnerpti, most likely Saru-Re's consort, and the mother of Ra-Nefer and Netjererenre. For more sons, Karkare, Horemsaf, Ramesaf and Nebankre are also shown on reliefs from Saru-Re's mortuary temple, but the identity of their mother is not defined. Saru-Re's own mother was Queen Neferhetepes II, a relief from Saru-Re's causeway depicting him and his queen, Merodnerpti, together with the king's mother, identified as a Neferhetepes, Merodnerpti herself possibly a daughter of Djedefer and Hetepheres II,
which very likely confirms Neferhetepes as Yusukuf's wife.
After Yusukuf's death, Neferhetepes II possibly married Ti, who was possibly her cousin, and they had a daughter, Nefertnerpti, Saru-Re's half-sister, who also became Saru-Re's consort. Neferhetepes was also most likely the mother of Merodnerpti by Yusukuf, meaning Saru-Re therefore also most likely married his full sister.
And, in the process, he protected his claim to the throne from other potential challenges. Further security of his claim to the throne was the continuity of having Sekhemkara, his great-great-uncle and vizier under Yusukuf, as his vizier as well.
The fragment of a statue with the name of the king was discovered in 2015 in El Kab, and a stela bearing Saru-Re's name was discovered in the diorite quarries in the desert northwest of Abu Simbel, while even further south, Saru-Re's cartouche has been found in graffiti in Tunis and on seal impressions from Buin, at the second cataract of the Nile. Considered an efficient ruler and one of the most important kings of the Old Kingdom, the majority of Saru-Re's activities in Egypt, as recorded in the Palermo stone, are religious in nature, the making of a divine barge during the 5th year of his reign, possibly in Heliopolis, the exact quantity of daily offerings of bread and beer to Ra, Hathor, Nekbet, and Wajet, and the gift of land to various temples. He also reorganized the cult of his mother, Neferhetepes II, adding an entrance portico with 4 columns to her temple, but so that the entrance was no longer facing Yusuf's pyramid.
Was that done for purely practical reasons, or was there some political reason for the change? We just don't know.
Saru Ray's military career, known primarily from reliefs from his mortuary complex, consisted of military campaigns against Libyan chieftains in the Western Desert, bringing back livestock to Egypt. Saru Ray launched several naval expeditions to modern-day Lebanon to procure trunks of precious cedar trees, people, most likely slaves from the East, and exotic items. He also negotiated important trade agreements with other nations such as Byblos. Saru Ray's palace, called Uetis Nafaru Saru Ray's splendor soars up to heaven, is known from an inscription discovered in Neferhefre's mortuary temple and was likely located on the shores of the Abu Sir Lake, but exactly where is unknown.
Still buried, somewhere beneath the sand of Egypt.
Other archaeological evidence suggests that Saru Ray abandoned Saqqara and Gezer and concentrated his building activities at Abu Sir, where he constructed a pyramid and mortuary complex, and, in its immediate vicinity, and possibly motivated by the presence of the Sun Temple of Yusuf, which continued to be modified during Saru Ray's reign, his own sun temple called the Field of Ra, although it is yet to be located. New analyses of inscriptions on the Palermo stone reveal the precise architecture of the temple and indicate it was the first to make use of palm-form columns whose tops are shaped like palm fronds, that would become standard for columns throughout Egypt from then on. A few limestone blocks bearing reliefs which once adorned the temple have been found embedded in the walls of the mortuary complex of Nusra-Ini, Saru Ray's fourth successor.
This suggests either that these blocks were left over from the construction of the temple, or that Nusra used Sahure's temple as a quarry for construction materials.
The pyramid complex of Saru Ray, called Saru Ray's Soul Shines, is very important because it was the first temple with the new design, and built of limestone and granite, and the first temple to have such a quantity and quality of magnificent reliefs on the walls. It would serve as the template for all mortuary complexes constructed from Saru Ray's reign until the end of the Old Kingdom, some 300 years later.
But was it built by Sahure? That's the question. Perhaps, like the pyramid, it predates him by tens of thousands of years. Let's see if there are any clues.
The main pyramid of Saru Ray's mortuary complex, the first pyramid built at Abu Sir, exemplifies the decline of pyramid building since the 4th dynasty, both in terms of size and in its quality. Due to its ruined condition, the exact specifications and appearance of the pyramid are impossible to determine, however. With a base length of 78 meters, a slope of around 50 degrees and an original height of 48 meters, the pyramid of Saru Ray was around the same size as that of his predecessor, Yusuf.
That is, of course, if the pyramid was built by Sahure and not usurped by him, as it appears is the case with all the other pyramids.
The pyramid is probably founded upon a platform of at least 2 layers of limestone blocks. However, this is an assumption as the foundation has never been investigated. On it, the core of 6 horizontal layers of rough limestone blocks was built, with a casing of fine, white limestone. It is interesting to note a design flaw within the pyramid's architecture that resulted in the southeast corner being 1.58 meters too far to the east, meaning the pyramid is not completely square.
An oversight? Or was it intentional?
Its inner core is made of roughly hewn stones organized in steps with a crude filling of debris, and held together in many sections with a thick mortar of mud. This construction technique fared poorly over time when, after the casing stones were stolen in antiquity, the core became exposed, the pyramid now largely ruined and amounting to little more than a pile of rubble.
But what if Sahure didn't build the pyramid? What if it was already there, but in an extremely damaged condition because of a massive Great Flood or tsunami? What if the crude filling and mud mortar was Sahure's attempt to repair the pyramid? What other evidence would support that proposition?
While the core was under construction, a corridor was left open leading into the shaft where the burial chamber was built, and later covered by leftover stone blocks and debris.
Left open during construction? For what purpose? Wouldn't it make more sense the corridor was exposed by the massive surging waters of a tsunami? And that's why it was later covered by stone blocks and debris, much later, in an attempt to repair and rebuild the structure.
The entrance, at the north side, leads via a short descending corridor lined with red granite followed by a short ascending corridor, with the remnants of a portcullis protruding from either side of the wall, to the burial chamber with its gabled roof comprising large limestone beams, the largest 10 meters by 3 meters by 4 meters and weighing up to an estimated 220 tons. Today these beams are damaged, which weakens the pyramid structure.
Okay, this is strong evidence. A corridor lined with red granite leading to a chamber with massive limestone blocks up to 220 tons forming a gabled ceiling. We will take a more in-depth look at the pyramid when we get to Abu Sir later in the series. But the technological requirements for this sort of structure are far in excess of what was capable at the time. And the comparison of the evidence, massive limestone blocks and red granite against the use of debris and mud mortar just doesn't add up.
Sarure's accompanying mortuary temple is considered to be the most sophisticated one built up to that time, with many architectural innovations, such as the use of palm-form columns, massive granite architraves inscribed with Sarure's titulary and overlaid with copper, black basalt flooring and granite dados.
Again, red granite in massive architraves and dados, and basalt floors as well. As I said, we will look closely at the structure when we arrive at Abu Sir later in the series. But this certainly does not sound like the sort of structure of the 5th dynasty.
The walls of the entrance passage to the mortuary temple are built of fine quality limestone and were once lined with thick slabs of red granite.
Not just red granite, but thick slabs of it.
Over the years they'd been heavily quarried, but at least a third to a half of the stone that would have made up the walls and the granite lining still remained.
Was this temple, just like the ones at Giza, built on the site of a pre-existing temple and then usurped by Sahure?
A porticoed courtyard followed that led through a pair of extraordinary massive red granite columns, around 8 meters tall, each one carved from a single monolithic piece of granite, shaped like the trunk and crown of a palm tree, that were the remaining pair of 16 that once formed a perimeter around the rectangular open courtyard to the mortuary temple. Each column contains the name and title of Sahure, with the vulture goddess, Nekbet, in the south part of the courtyard, and the cobra goddess Wajet in the northern half.
Now, I wonder what this represents. Good and evil? Right and wrong? Positive and negative?
The columns would have at one time supported an architrave bearing the royal titles, on it resting limestone ceiling slabs decorated with stars, all forming an ambulatory around the perimeter of the open courtyard. There are still several large slabs of limestone from the ceiling at various locations around the perimeter, leaning against the remains of the courtyard walls, which contained a scene of victory of Sahure over the Asians and Libyans. Circling the courtyard, not much of the wall survives, containing, at best, fragments of the reliefs. Beyond the walls is what appears to be a surrounding corridor.
Why build a corridor all the way around the courtyard when you could simply walk through the courtyard? Unless the outer corridor was a later addition by a later pharaoh. or unless it had a specific purpose.
The corridor encircles the courtyard, its walls containing scenes of Saru fishing and hunting birds and other desert game. There is also a significant scene of the royal entourage and under the depiction of Nefer-ir-Kare, with text that was added, stating Nefer-ir-Kare, king of Upper and Lower Egypt.
Were the columns and inner wall original, dating back to who knows when, usurped by Sahura, who had his name scratched all over them? Then at some later stage, the outer wall and corridor of limestone was added, most probably by Nefer-ir-Kare. It makes sense, it's plausible, but who built the original temple? Because I'm sure it wasn't Sahura.
To the northern side of the courtyard, propped up off the ground on a few stones and blocks of wood, is a 10 meters long block of rectangular cut red granite, the orientation of its hieroglyphs indicating it had clearly been a massive lintel that perhaps sat atop the columns or part of the northern inner wall of the open courtyard. On it, the cartouche of Saru was clearly visible.
Sure, it was added during the reign of Sahura. Or was it? The standard execution and condition of the carving is superior, and it leads me to consider if the hieroglyphs are more in keeping with the hieroglyphs on some of the New Kingdom monuments. How did they survive so well preserved?
An examination of the floor reveals it was made of a jigsaw of irregularly shaped basalt slabs.
Basalt. Why basalt? That's a question we shall leave until we get to Abu Sir later in the series.
Between the ruins of the inner and outer wall, between two thick pieces of red granite, the weathering of the limestone and the granite shows that the inside of the wall is weathered whereas the outside is almost perfectly preserved.
That doesn't make sense. How does the inside of the wall weather that much, but the outer side stays almost pristine? It means it's not weathering. Well, not as we think of it. To affect both the limestone and the granite the way it has, very high temperatures and water or some other reactive agent must have been present, which means that at some time the courtyard was more than just a courtyard, and it must have had something to do with the basalt floor.
The entrance to the inner section of the temple is up a few steps between the lower sections of another two six-stemmed papyrus-shaped pillars of red granite and through the middle of the west wall of the central, dividing corridor. It leads to a chapel that once contained 5 granite niches, the walls covered in decorated limestone and the floor made of alabaster.
From basalt to alabaster, limestone and granite, but which came first? I'm sure it was the granite, but is the basalt contemporary with it?
A door to the south of the chapel leads via a westward corridor that supposedly only the priests could use towards the pyramid. Scaling the low remains of the southern wall of the corridor are several storage rooms on 2 levels, the enormous walls made from one single block of limestone over 6 feet tall, 2 feet wide and maybe 12 feet long. This is where the priests supposedly keep valuables.
And they may have, down the track. But why build a 2-story structure with dividing walls of massive blocks of fine Chura limestone that's not only local to this area when it would have been much easier to make them from smaller local blocks of sandstone? Stability? What event would you be expecting to necessitate such massive blocks? After all, it was only 2 stories high. An earthquake? Possibly. More likely a tsunami. Can you think of any building recently that has failed the structural test of being hit by a tsunami? The Fukushima reactor springs to mind. Could this have been some type of nuclear reactor? Perhaps not nuclear as such, but maybe some sort of power station.
The westernmost chamber, adjacent to the eastern face of the pyramid, was the offering hall, the ceiling of which was decorated with an astronomical scene of stars, the walls decorated with scenes depicting divinities carrying offerings for the dead king, and containing a floor of alabaster. On the west wall there was an enormous, granite false door that should have had inscriptions of magical spells, and the names and titles of Saru-Re. However, it did not, leading some Egyptologists to believe it was once covered in either copper or gold that was inscribed with this information.
So, a red granite, false door, no inscriptions, possibly covered in copper or gold. That to me smacks of functionality. Not decorative, but where is it now? And is its undecorated state the norm for all false doors prior to them being usurped and defaced in the dynastic eras?
Beyond the offering hall are several small annexes with grooves in the floor, clearly part of some sort of pre-designed plumbing system that once contained over 180 meters of copper pipes, all of which connected to the main channel. Within the annexes were 5 stone basins, once lined with copper.
What if the pipes and basins didn't just take water away? What if they brought water up and into the temple as well? A modern plumbing system, at least 3,000 years before the Romans.
At east, through the northern annex rooms back to the central corridor, and then north out of the temple via the side door, the flooring changes from basalt to limestone and has been cut into up to 10-sided tiles.
It's not as if the ancient Egyptians didn't know how to make perfect squares or rectangles.
It's like the whole floor has been carefully and deliberately planned to be irregular.
Why didn't they do that? Surely it would be much easier to cut and lay uniform paving stones. It is, but uniform structures are easily disrupted by specific vibrational frequencies, whereas a random pattern has a far greater level of tolerance and resistance. So what I'm suggesting is that the whole temple floor, the whole temple base, was deliberately designed to withstand vibration. But not earthquakes, the vibrations caused by the very function of the building itself.
One of the interesting finds here in the temple of Saqqara is this piece of basalt, which you may not be able to see, but it has these regular grooves in the stone. Now clearly that's not ornamental, it's function. Exactly what the function is, we don't know. But maybe it's something to do with this. It's musical. So was it part of a musical instrument? Was it part of some specific tuning? We don't know. But it's fun.
We'll leave that until we get to Abu Sir later in the series.
The southern end of the central corridor leads through 2 small side chambers, past a portico with the bottom parts of 2 pink granite columns, and out into the desert towards the Pyramid of Nusra.
More red granite.
One corridor leaves the mortuary temple, back through the entrance to the east, via the causeway, of which very little remains except for the large, rough limestone blocks forming its base ramp. Egyptologists believe it was once a corridor, with a roof containing small open spaces for light, and walls to either side, covered in many colourful reliefs.
I find that a bit strange, because the surface of this is so irregular. Not what you would expect to find of a smooth walking path. But if we consider the whole area was buried in 15 feet or so of tsunami sediment, sometime around the end of the 17th dynasty, then it's possible that this is not the floor of the corridor, it's the ceiling.
In the centre of the floor is a drainage channel.
What a bizarre place to put a drainage channel, right in the middle of an important walkway. Unless the floor was then covered in paving tiles, or in fact the floor was the ceiling.
The causeway leads down 200 meters to the Valley Temple, lining up north to south, most of what is left overgrown with bulrushes. Most Valley temples have one ramp, from the east, from the Nile, but the Valley Temple of Saru-Re has two landing ramps, one from the east and the other from the south, the east entrance once having 8 pink granite columns, the south, 4 columns.
There are those red granite columns again.
Both entrances lead to a central room with a roof of stars, the walls covered with many coloured reliefs, and part of a red granite column that had been painted white, probably by a later usurper.
And that's strong evidence of the difference in dates between the column and the later usurping.
The floor is made of basalt, cut into irregularly sized and shaped stones.
Just like the mortuary temple, clearly it's been precision cut, not bashed with chunks of diorite.
The reliefs in the Valley Temple, Causeway, and Mortuary Temple cover an estimated 10,000 square meters, many of the surviving fragments of very high quality and much more elaborate than those from preceding mortuary temples, representing the highest level of this type of temple discovered from the Old Kingdom. Several reliefs from the temple and accompanying causeway are unique in Egyptian art, including a relief showing the bringing of the pyramidion, or capstone, to the main pyramid, and the ceremonies following the completion of the complex.
The reliefs are great, but the reality is that they could have been added at any time. Decorating a temple doesn't mean it was necessarily built at the same time, and the bringing of the pyramidion to crown the main pyramid may not necessarily mean the completion of the pyramid. It could just as easily mean the discovery of the displaced capstone and its replacement on a renovated and restored pyramid damaged sometime in the past. And yet, despite all these amazing reliefs, there are no reliefs in the pyramid. Why not?
The mortuary complex immediately around the pyramid also comprises a second much smaller pyramid, likely built for the car of the king.
No, not likely built for his car. That's a speculation. But it is highly likely that, like the main pyramid itself, it was built much earlier and for a completely different purpose, which I shall discuss in a later episode.
The satellite pyramid, though little more than a small rounded mound of sand and small stone fragments, contains shards of basalt, granite, limestone, and quartzite. Greatly damaged, it has an entrance corridor that first descends before rising into the inner chamber, though nothing was found inside.
It depends what you're looking for. What are the inner chambers made of? Is there or was there a red granite portcullis? The shards on the mound suggest there may have been.
In his last year on the throne, Saru-Re sent the first documented expedition to the fabled land of Punt, bringing back 80,000 measures of myrrh, along with malachite and electrum. The success of this venture celebrated in a relief from his mortuary temple, which shows him tending a myrrh tree in the garden of his palace named Saru-Re's Splendor Soars Up to Heaven, the only relief in Egyptian art depicting a king gardening. Saru-Re also sent further expeditions to the turquoise and copper mines of Wadi Maghara and Wadi Karit in the Sinai Peninsula, bringing back over 6,000 units of copper to Egypt, and also produced 2 reliefs in Sinai, one of which shows Saru-Re in the traditional act of smiting Asiatics and boasting, "The great God smites the Asiatics of all countries." Many though credit Saru-Re with a reign of 13 years, the Turin Canon with a reign of 12 years 5 months and 12 days. Similarly, the Palermo stone preserves his 2nd, 3rd, 5th and 6th years on the throne, as well as his final year of reign, and even records the day of his death as the 28th of Shimu II, corresponding to the end of the 9th month. The document notes 6 or 7 cattle counts, which would indicate a reign of at least 12 full years. If this assumption is correct and Saru-Re's highest attested date was the year after the 6th count, then this date would mean that Saru-Re died in his 13th year on the throne and should be given a reign of 12 years, 5 months, and 12 days.
Finally, all of the dates are in the same ballpark.
Saru-Re's most immediate legacy is his funerary cult, which continued after his death until the end of the Old Kingdom some 300 years later, and he continued to receive religious offerings during the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom when Prince Set, a son of Ramses II, undertook restoration works throughout Egypt on pyramids and temples which had fallen into ruin. Inscriptions on the stone cladding of the Pyramid of Saru-Re showing that it was restored at this time.
What restoration work was done? And why? Was the crude filling of debris and the thick mortar of mud attributable to Set? And what happened, and when, to cause the damage in the first place? I guess we'll have to find out when we get to Abu Sir later in the series.
According to the Palermo stone, the next to take the throne, Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai, ascended the throne on the 28th day of the 9th month, the day after the death of his father, Saru-Re. Nefer-ir-Kare was the last pharaoh to significantly modify the standard royal titulary, being the first to separate the nomen, or birth name, from the prenomen, or throne name. From his reign onwards, the former was written in a cartouche preceded by the son of Ra epithet. Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai's twin was Nefer-ir-Re, and nothing more is known of him, although it has been suggested he briefly seized the throne under the name of Shepsis-Kare at the unexpected death of Nefer-ir-Kare's son and successor, Nefer-Hefre, who died in his early 20s after only 2 years on the throne.
But more on that later.
Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai and Nefer-ir-Re had at least 4 other brothers, Kar-Kare, Horemsaf, Ramesaf, and Nebank-Re, although the identity of the other brothers' mother or mothers is unknown, meaning they are therefore, at the least, Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai's half-brothers. However, no evidence of any daughters of Saru-Re and his consort, Queen Meritnerpti, has been discovered. The only currently known queen of Nefer-ir-Kare-Kekai is Khentkaus II, several reliefs representing both of them together along with her title of a king's wife. This is reinforced by the position of her pyramid next to that of Nefer-ir-Kare, as was normal for the consort of a king.
But what if not only wasn't the pyramid built for Nefer-ir-Kare, but neither was the pyramid beside it built for Khentkaus II?
Nefer-ir-Kare could possibly have had at least one other spouse, as suggested by the presence of a small pyramid next to that of Khentkaus, but this remains conjectural.
See, this is what Egyptologists do. They don't deal in fact, they conjure stories. Perhaps all the pyramids are where they are for totally different reasons. And there is no other queen, and there never was.
Nefer-ir-Kare and his consort Khentkaus II were, in all likelihood, the parents of Prince Ra-Nefer-B, the future pharaoh Nefer-Hefre. This relationship confirmed by a relief on a limestone slab discovered in a house in the village near Abu Sir depicting Nefer-ir-Kare and his wife, Khentkaus, with the king's eldest son, Ra-Nefer, a name identical with some variants of Nefer-Hefre's own before he took the throne. Nefer-ir-Kare and Khentkaus II had at least one other child together, the future pharaoh Nusra-Ini. Nefer-ir-Kare's consort, Khentkaus II, is known to have been Nusra's mother, since excavations of her mortuary temple yielded a fragmentary relief showing her facing Nusra and his family, both Khentkaus and Nusra the same size, which may be connected with Khentkaus' enhanced status as Nusra sought to legitimize his rule following the premature death of Nefer-Hefre and the possible challenge by Shepsis-Kare. Yet another son of Nefer-ir-Kare and Khentkaus II has been proposed, probably younger than both Neferhefre and Nusra, a prince, Iripat, Irienrer, whose relationship is suggested by the fact that his funerary cult was associated with that of his mother, both having taken place in the temple of Khentkhaz II.
He may not actually be a son of Neferyokare though. It's possible Khentkhaz married Netjererenre, Shepseskare, or rather Netjererenre married her, or she married one of Neferyokare Kakai's other 4 brothers, and Irienre came from that pairing. There's also the obscure possibility that Khentkhaz II had a child to her own son, Neferefre. These Egyptians had pretty relaxed beliefs.
Finally, it is most likely Nefer-Irkare and Khentkhaz II may also be the parents of Queen Khentkhaz III, whose tomb was discovered in Abu Sir in 2015. Indeed, based on the location and general date for her tomb, as well as her titles of a king's wife and a king's mother, Khentkhaz III was almost certainly Neferhefre's consort and the mother of Menkaure-Keu. Nefer-Irkare is attested in 2 ancient Egyptian king lists, both dating to the New Kingdom, the Abydos king list and the Saqqara tablet, as well as the Turin canon, which gives some credibility to many those division of dynasties, but apart from a few specific administrative actions taken by Nefer-Irkare, little else is known of his reign. In his first year as king, Nefer-Irkare granted land to the agricultural estates serving the cults of the Ennead, the souls of Pe and Nekhen, and the gods of Kur-Ahar, dedicated an offering table to Ra and Hathor, and ordered the construction of 2 storerooms and the employment of new dependents in the host temple. He also commanded the fashioning and opening of the mouth of an electrum statue of the god Ihi for the Mert chapel of Sneferu, of the Nert shrine of Hathor. Seal impressions and broken pottery bearing his name uncovered at Buin indicate his continued trade relations with Nubia, and a single alabaster bowl inscribed with his name unearthed at Byblos suggests it was also possible there were contacts with the Levantine coast. There is even less evidence for military action during Nefer-Irkare's reign. A few fragmentary limestone statues of kneeling and bound prisoners of war discovered in his mortuary temple, possibly attesting to punitive raids in Libya to the west or the Sinai and Canaan to the east, but such statues were customary elements of the decoration of royal temples and mastabas, suggesting that they may not be immediately related to actual military campaigns. As for construction during his reign, ancient sources indicate Nefer-Irkare, like his immediate predecessors, built a temple to the sun god Ra, calling his Setib Re, meaning site of the heart of Ra. Supposedly the largest sun temple built during the 5th dynasty, it is yet to be discovered.
Why would that be? There must be ruins somewhere, perhaps meters below the current surface.
It is possible the temple was only built out of mud brick, with a planned completion in stone, but construction had not started when Nefer-Irkare died, in which case, it would rapidly have turned into ruins that would be very difficult to locate for archaeologists.
Or because it was either swept away by a great flood or buried under the sand and silt of a tsunami. Possibly both.
However, some details of its layout are known. It had a large central obelisk, an altar and storerooms, a sealed bark room housing 2 boats, and a hall of the said festival. Although an obelisk was eventually part of Userkesef Temple of the Sun, this is the first mention of an obelisk being created in ancient Egypt.
I wonder if that's because they weren't made then, that they're the remnants of a much earlier time. Let's take a look.
It was during the 5th dynasty that the obelisk, as an object, began to play a more significant role in ancient Egyptian life, especially inside the temples of Ra, where they supposedly were a sacred symbol of the cult of the sun.
We actually don't know if that's true or not. It's a speculation. It's possible the obelisks were around a long time earlier, but were never written on never claimed by rulers. Perhaps obelisks had a function, be it physical, scientific, or ceremonial, that we just haven't discovered. So, just what are obelisks?
The word obelisk is taken from the Greek word obeliskos, meaning spit, as in a long-pointed piece of wood generally used for cooking, and came about because the Greek historian Herodotus, who was the first to write about them, so named them around 440 BC. But to the ancient Egyptians they were called tekhenu, which means to pierce, as in to pierce the sky.
We don't even really know if that's a correct translation. It's just a guess. But what if it is true? What does that mean? Just what was it that was piercing the sky? And why the need for it to travel upwards? And how did it do that?
The earliest tekhenu no longer exist, and we only know they existed because of later inscriptions, but they appear to have been only about 3 meters tall, with their pyramid-shaped apexes covered with precious metals.
Why cover the tip in metal? And I must say, that shows an advanced knowledge of electroplating techniques. Were the tekhenu some form of lightning rod or conductor, or possibly some sort of aerial? Was this the need for them to pierce the sky? Were they broadcasting to the stars, to their gods? What if they were lighthouses?
The tekhenu represented the benben, the primordial sacred mound that rose from the primal waters upon which the people of Kemet, ancient Egypt, believed the god Artem stood at the creation of the world. In essence, a tekhenu lifted the benben to the sun, and so was closely associated with the sun god, Ra. As the sun's rays struck the pyramidal top of the obelisk, the reflected light filled the temple, giving the people a symbol of the power of the sun.
Very romantic, and it would indeed have been pretty impressive. But it's speculation, it's hardly conclusive, especially when the angles don't line up.
Because of their association with the sun god, Ra, the tekhenu were associated with the Binu bird, the Egyptian precursor to the Greek phoenix.
How interesting. In Greek mythology, a phoenix is a long-lived bird that cyclically regenerates, or is otherwise born again. Was this regeneration somehow connected to the Dogon myths of reincarnation that we explored back in episode 8? And is there even more to it?
Associated with the sun, a phoenix lives for 500 years, then dies in a show of flames and combustion, before it obtains new life by rising from the ashes of its predecessor.
There's a parallel here. Are they referring to a civilization that dies in flame, with new civilizations arising out of the ashes, and that it does this regularly, as part of a cycle of some sort? Let's keep digging.
According to some Egyptian myths, the Binu bird was the first living creature whose cry awoke creation and set life in motion. The bird was linked to the morning star and the renewal of each day, but was also the sign of the end of the world.
So, the tekhenu are not only linked to creation, but also to destruction. Even more than that, to the end of the world, and as part of a regular cycle. But how? And why? And why would the ancient Egyptians even mention the end of the world? Unless perhaps at one time there was one, or several.
Many tekhenu were taken from their original locations, and there are examples of kings usurping a tekhenu by adding their own inscriptions to those of an earlier ruler.
Why would they do that? Simply because manufacturing a colossal tekhenu was not an easy task. Why go through the labour and expense of manufacturing and then transporting such a monument when you could just as easily usurp and inscribe one that had belonged to someone else who had died, perhaps centuries or even millennia earlier?
The earliest surviving tekhenu dates to the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom and bears the names of the king, Senusret Kare, Senusret I, who ruled from around 1971 BC to 1926 BC, commissioning two Tekhenu to celebrate his 30-year jubilee, or Heb-Sed festival.
Or did he simply usurp two earlier ones? We really don't know. And why don't we find any of the earlier ones?
Through well-documented inscriptions and drawings, archaeologists and scholars believe they understand how the obelisks arrived at the banks of the Nile.
But before we do that, let's go back to episode 7 and recap on how these obelisks were actually quarried.
According to Egyptologists, in ancient times, obelisks and other large stone objects were usually blocked out roughly before they left the quarry. Firstly, the ancient Egyptians created a row of holes about 10 centimeters wide, inserted wood into the holes, then poured water onto the wood. This caused the wood to expand, and the force was supposedly sufficient to cause the rock to split and separate from the bedrock, leaving the rough shape of the object free to be further worked.
There is certainly evidence that this method was employed in Roman times. But does it necessarily apply to much earlier times? One would think they would have had to do the bottom, underneath first, then the side, but who knows? It's still a hard concept to grasp.
Another method may have been to cut a groove with stone tools, or a primitive saw used with an abrasive, which would then be heated with charcoal and rapidly cooled with water, causing the stone to split.
More speculation, we just don't know for sure.
The next step would have been to smoothen the sides, and, given the primitive soft metal tools of the ancient Egyptians, one method proposed was where bricks would have been heated and put on the places that needed to be treated. Then, when the rock was sufficiently hot, cold water would have been poured on, and the uneven parts would have come off in flakes, thanks to the crystalline structure of the granite.
Wow, that's just so simple. Just create exfoliation points and surface parallel fracture systems. But how do they heat the bricks to a sufficient temperature to allow for convection and the granite heating up? Or did they light fires actually on the obelisk? Maybe they used a blowtorch, or even better, a magnifying glass or convex mirror to focus the sun's rays into sections. Any other scatterbrained ideas?
An alternate proposal is that the ancient Egyptians used small hand-sized balls of diorite, one of the few substances on Earth that is harder than granite, to pound against the surfaces of the roughly hewn obelisks until all the superfluous knobs and irregularities were flattened out.
Bashing rocks against rocks. Remember, these obelisks are gun barrel straight, perfectly flat, with perfect 90-degree edges over a length of 30 meters. It just sounds so ridiculous and so time-consuming, even if they did have 100 guys working on it at the same time.
The final stage would have been to smooth the remaining rough shape, and, to do that, quartz sand and water was used.
That's a hell of a lot of elbow grease needed, not to mention the time. One only has to run their hand over the smooth surface to come to the conclusion that they were not sanded smooth. Of course, it's possible. And that's the point with Egyptologists. They surmise, they speculate, but then they ridicule and deride anybody else who's not an Egyptologist who does the same thing. And it really comes down to a head because of the existence of the unfinished obelisk.
Now, the Egyptologists say that they were cutting this piece out using chisels. Something about that doesn't make sense to me. If they're chiseling it out with hammers and stones, that tells you a particular technology. That technology is inconsistent with them moving a piece of stone this massive. So what's the answer?
Once the carving of the pillar was finished, ropes were slung around it and the stone was positioned on a heavy sledge. Then several thousand workmen would pull the sledge down specially carved ramps, built to transport stones from the quarries down to lower levels and the river, where they were loaded onto vessels waiting in specially designed dry docks so as to allow for the safe loading of the stone monoliths. There are many well-preserved examples of this type of ramp in the quarries on the west bank at Aswan that connected to stone-paved roads, creating a wide stone transportation network.
So, did they quarry them, or did they usurp them?
That completed, the vessel and the sacred cargo were slowly floated, the dock gates were opened, and the vessel made its way out onto the Nile, where 9 galleys, each with more than 30 rowers, towed the vessel and the obelisk to its final location, where they were offloaded, transported to the temple and, although no one actually knows how, raised onto a great base in an open court in front of various temples for religious and political reasons.
Oh my god, where do I start? All this opinion is based on a few reliefs in Queen Hatshepsut's Deir el-Bahari temple on the west bank at Luxor. How did they get the stone, weighing 1,000 tonne, onto a sled? And assuming they did, why wasn't the sled crushed under the weight? Then, thousands of men pulling the sled. How did that work? How many ropes? How many on each rope? And let's not forget the ground would not have been smooth, more likely undulating and sandy. And how did they actually pull the sled onto the barge, even in dry dock? And have they found any evidence of specially designed dry docks? Of any dry docks? No. And given the time, say 2400 BC, what wooden boat made of papyrus or anything could support a 1,000 tonne block of granite and not sink? Recently, an Italian Egyptologist tried to float a 3.5 tonne block of limestone across the river and failed miserably because the boat started sinking. Then they had to get the block off the boat and to its location. And when were the cartouches and hieroglyphs carved all over them?
Many Egyptologists believe that the carvings and reliefs on the obelisks were done once the obelisk was in its final position.
It seems to me the easiest part of the whole process, if easiest is the right word, was the raising of the obelisk. But we don't even know how that was done. And all modern day efforts to replicate the raising of an obelisk using ancient Egyptian technologies have failed. In 1995, a NOVA team, led by the noted archaeologist Mark Lehner, attempted to raise an obelisk based on the Egyptian sources, and they failed miserably. Even when they used more modern techniques, they failed as well. So, how did they do it?
In 2001, aeronautics professor Maury Garib and a team raised a 6,900-pound obelisk using kites, a pulley system, and a support frame. Harnessing wind power and carefully calculating the leverage needed for the pulley system, the obelisk was raised in just 25 seconds.
Very clever, except for several things. 1, 6,900 pound is a tad under 3 tonne and nowhere near 1,000 tonne. 2, how did they regulate the wind in ancient Egypt, if there was any? And 3, there are no records indicating a use of kites in construction in ancient Egypt. But what if the obelisks were already in place, and the so-called well-documented inscriptions and drawings were simply the ancient Egyptians trying to understand how the obelisks were created and moved? It's possible, and it's far more plausible than what we've been told. And if that is the case, then what were the obelisks really? Were they just massive propaganda billboards on which the pharaohs plastered their achievements? Or were they offers of prayers pointing upwards to the gods? Or were they something else altogether? Certainly once in position, they appeared to not only point to the skies, but focus energy in that direction. And that brings us to the inscriptions on them.
Many Egyptologists believe that the carvings and reliefs on the obelisks were done once the obelisk was in its final position.
And perhaps they were. Perhaps the obelisks had been in place for centuries, pristine, without inscriptions. I mean, surely it would be easier to inscribe an obelisk while it's lying horizontal, then roll it over to another side and start again. Carving them vertically would mean erecting some sort of scaffolding, reaching about 40 metres into the heavens. Or did the ancient stonemasons have wings? One thing is certain, they went to a hell of a lot of trouble to create them. However, the whole process, quarrying them, transporting them, and positioning them before temples or pylons, raises significant technological discrepancies here that have not been fully addressed, despite what the Egyptologists propose. The truth is, no one knows how these obelisks were created, and they shouldn't get on their high horses and pretend that they do. Until definite, irrefutable proof can be found to support or negate any specific theory, any and all are valid, no matter who puts them forward. However, there can be one conclusion that is definite. That is, that the ancient Egyptians knew something that we don't know. Maybe it was something to do with the very stone itself, something to do with the silicon comprising them. Maybe the stone was levitated. Just because we don't know how the ancient Egyptians achieved this doesn't mean it didn't happen. We just don't know. We might find out more about that in a later episode. The key issue here is the obelisks were massive pieces of red granite weighing hundreds, even up to 1,000 tonne each. And the structures they were erected before were made of sandstone, with blocks significantly smaller and lighter. So, what was, or is, so special about red granite? Apart from being extremely strong, resilient, and beautifully textured, there must have been a greater reason, or even need, to go to the huge efforts needed to remove and relocate this granite. It seems important that the obelisks be one continuous piece. The same with the sarcophagi and the other objects. Now that tells me that not only was the aesthetics a contributing factor, but also the functionality and possibly even the vibrational aspects as well. Who knows? Maybe it's the vibrational properties of granite that were the key factor for its choice. Meaning, could the obelisks have been some sort of energy transmitter or receiver, a cosmic energy antenna or radio station? Clearly, when it comes to granite, there's much more than meets the eye. And we shall get to that later in the series. But for now, let's check back in on the 5th dynasty.
The festival of the Night of Ra, a festival concerned with Ra's journey during the night and connected with the ideas of renewal and rebirth, is specifically said to have taken place in the Setib Re, Nefer Irkares, whole of the said festival, with this journey being made by boat, indicating that the Setib Re was not adjacent to Nefer Irkares pyramid.
It also says that there were considerable waterways there at the time. Canals, harbours, possibly even the Nile itself. What happened for them to just disappear?
In addition, it has been proposed that construction on the necking ray of Yusukov continued under Nefer Irkare Karkai and was completed sometime around the 5th cattle count of his reign, providing the necking ray with its monumental obelisk of limestone and red granite.
And there's that red granite again. We know it originally came from Aswan. The question is when, and what was its original function? We may find the answers to that when we get to Abu Sir towards the end of the series. But for now we need to just focus on the evidence, because there are several difficulties with that proposed hypothesis. Firstly, it would imply 25 years between the erection of the Yusukaf temple and that of its obelisk. Secondly, if both the pyramid and the sun temple of Nefer Irkare were unfinished at his death, Why did the king devote exceptional effort on a monument of Userkaf when his own still required substantial works to be completed? Thirdly, there's the issue of the red granite. Where did it come from? And why was it part of the temple? And that wasn't all he was supposedly building.
Nefer-ir-Kare also started a pyramid for himself at Abu Sir, called Bar Nefer-ir-Kare, meaning Nefer-ir-Kare is a bar. It was initially planned to be a step pyramid, the construction comprising 3 stages, the first being 6 steps of rubble with retaining walls of locally quarried limestone. This was an unusual design for the time, one which had not been used since the 3rd dynasty, some 120 years earlier.
Maybe because it wasn't the plan to build a pyramid. It was the plan to rebuild a damaged structure.
However, as the original step casing reached the top of the first layer, the architects decided to modify the plan and enlarge the structure to 8 core levels, through the addition of filling between the steps, and to transform the monument into a true pyramid, although the blocks in the upper several levels are clearly not cut as finely as those on the lower levels.
Was this a later addition, at a time when there was a rush to rebuild and repair the structure?
At a later stage, the workers enlarged the pyramid further, to a base of 105 meters with a slope of around 53 degrees and height of 72 meters, and adding a girdle of masonry and smooth casing stones of red granite to make it the largest pyramid in Abu Sir, roughly equaling the size of the pyramid of Menkaure. However, it was never completed owing to the death of the king.
All of that doesn't make sense. The Egyptologists are suggesting an initial backward step in engineering of 120 years, followed by a modification to a later engineering plan during construction, and that the whole thing was never finished because Nefer-ir-Kare died. Surely his son and successor could have finished the job. If not for his father, then surely for himself. It makes no sense at all to just walk away from a massive building project and leave it unfinished. And then there's the issue of the red granite. What makes more sense to me is that the 3rd stage advanced structure was damaged by some natural disaster. And much later, once the knowledge had been lost, someone tried to repair and rebuild it. But we will have to wait and see.
Today it is in ruins owing to extensive stone robbing.
The answer to everything. Someone stole the stones. Well, shouldn't they be somewhere? Isn't it just as plausible the stones were swept away and buried by massive torrents of surging water?
The entrance to the pyramid's substructures is about 2 meters up on its north side, where a unique descending corridor built of limestone, with a roof is flat but with a second gabled roof of massive limestone beams above it, leads to a chamber about 2.5 meters below the base of the pyramid protected by a granite barrier. No pieces of the sarcophagus of the king were found there.
I will leave any further examination of the substructure until we get to Abu Sir later in the series. But why the gabled roof? And how big were these limestone beams? If they were bigger than the ones in the pyramid, one has to ask why. More questions for when we get to Abu Sir.
The pyramid of Nefer-ir-Kare is surrounded by smaller pyramids and tombs which seem to form an architectural unit, the cemetery of his close family.
That seems to me to be a speculation. It's not based on any factual evidence. It's based on a belief that the kings built the pyramids as tombs. But if they didn't build them, if they were usurped by the kings, then what is the significance of the location of the pyramids? And does it have anything to do with the association of Abu Rawash to Sirius, and the Giza pyramids to the constellation of Orion and the star map? Well, yes it does, but we'll get to all of that in a later episode.
The pyramid complex itself was apparently once surrounded by a great mud brick wall, parts of which are barely distinguishable today, that encompassed the pyramid and a mortuary temple, built in stages.
Now, why would you build massive mud brick walls? Was it simply to keep people out? Or was it to protect what was inside the compound from the sort of flooding caused by a tsunami?
The complex was reached from the Nile via a causeway and a valley temple near the river. However, as both Nefer-ir-Kare and his heir Nefer-Hefre died before their pyramid complexes could be finished, only the foundations of both had been laid, and Nusra altered the layout, diverting the causeway leading to Nefer-ir-Kare's pyramid to his own.
What if the original structures were complete, way before the 5th dynasty, then swept away by massive surging torrents of water from the Great Flood or other tsunamis, and it was not until the reign of Nusra that it was properly excavated and rebuilding commenced, using parts of the ruins, the substructure, the columns, to create a new causeway and valley temple? That makes more sense to me.
Because of its proximity to the Nile, the valley temple of Nefer-ir-Kare is almost gone, its floor originally around 5 meters below the present ground level.
As far as I'm concerned, 5 meters is consistent with the level of debris of stone and mud from previous massive tsunamis.
The valley temple had 2 columned entrances, the west one having 2 colonnades with 4 pink granite 6-stemmed papyrus-shaped columns bearing Nusra's names and titles. This entrance led to a harbour ramp, paved with basalt, and a granite dado.
To me, the pink granite columns are a massive giveaway. They are much older. But what about the reliefs and hieroglyphs carved into them? What else do they tell other than Nusra's names and titles? What state are they in? And what is the standard of skill in the carving, the tools used? And then there is that reference to basalt again, like in the temple of Sahura we examined earlier. You can be sure we'll check all of that out later in the series when we get to Abu Sir.
A significant cache of administrative papyri was discovered here, recording details pertaining to Nefer-ir-Kare's mortuary temple, its central chapel housing a niche with 5 statues of the king, the central one described as being a representation of the king as Osiris, while the first and last ones depicted him as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, respectively.
Were they representations of Nefer-ir-Kare, or were they much older? Truth is, we don't know.
The papyri also indicate that of the 4 boats included in the mortuary complex, 2 were buried to the north and south of the pyramid.
These boats are clear indications this was a harbour of some sort, and were the boats buried on purpose by Nefer-ir-Kare? If so, why? Or were they buried at some later stage by the actions of a great flood, or some other massive tsunami? And, if so, when and why?
The eastern part of Nefer-ir-Kare's mortuary temple was built mostly from mud brick with a floor of packed clay and consisted of a 4-columned portico of wooden columns, a columned entrance hall with 6 pairs of wooden columns, all in the shape of 4 lotus stems, and an open columned courtyard with 38 lotus-shaped wooden columns.
Here again is the proof that the ancient Egyptians of the 5th dynasty did not have the technical knowledge to quarry and move red granite. If anyone was going to have red granite columns, it would have been Nefer-ir-Kare. But he didn't. He had columns, not even of limestone, but of wood.
The oldest, in a section of the temple, located immediately to the east side of the pyramid, is built of limestone on a small stone platform, perhaps the site of an earlier structure. It consisted of an offering hall, 3 annexes, and 5 niche chapels.
And if the pyramid predated Nefer-ir-Kare, then it's highly plausible that the inner sections of the mortuary temple predated him as well.
Nefer-ir-Kare's mortuary temple was unfinished at his death, but completed later, by his sons Neferhefre and Nusra-Ini, using cheap mud bricks and wood rather than stone.
Here is the true archaeological evidence of the construction techniques used at the time of Neferhefre and Nusra. Cheap mud bricks and wood. The evidence indicates it wasn't construction, rather it was reconstruction, the rebuilding of the damaged pyramids and their associated structures.
Beyond his supposed construction of a sun temple, a pyramid and a mortuary temple, Nefer-ir-Kare's reign was unusual for the significant number of surviving contemporary records and inscriptions, many in the tombs of many of his contemporaries such as his vizier Washpitar, an elderly nobleman and royal courtier named Roer, and the priest Akhet-Hetep, that describe him as a good king, a kind, well-respected and benevolent ruler who intervened in favor of his courtiers after a mishap.
When Raura was accidentally touched by the king's mace, a situation which could have resulted in this official to immediately be put to death or banished from the court, Nefer-ir-Kare quickly pardoned Raura and commanded that no harm should come to him.
Similarly, when Washpitar suffered a stroke while at court, the king quickly summoned the palace's chief doctors to treat his dying vizier. When Washpitar died, Nefer-ir-Kare was reportedly inconsolable and retired to his personal quarters to mourn the loss of his friend. The king then ordered the purification of Washpitar's body in his presence and ordered an ebony coffin made for the deceased vizier, subsequently burying Washpitar with special endowments and rituals courtesy of Nefer-ir-Kare. During his reign, Nefer-ir-Kare remained a living god and saw the growth of the Egyptian administration and priesthood, which grew even more powerful than in earlier reigns. In particular, his rule witnessed a growth in the number of administration and priesthood officials, with the highest offices of viziers and overseer of the expedition open to people from outside the royal family. In conjunction with this trend, high officials used their expanded wealth to build architecturally more sophisticated mastabas, for example, including chapels with multiple rooms, and, from the mid to late 5th dynasty, wide entrance porticos with columns and family tomb complexes. It is also at this time that these officials first started to record their biographies on the walls of their tombs.
And isn't it amazing that all these structures survived, but that no administrative or residential structures did? What if these tombs weren't tombs? They were offices and homes.
Many though assigns Nefer-ir-Kare a reign of 20 years, but the recent archaeological evidence suggests this is an overestimate. The damaged Palermo stone preserving the year of the 5th cattle count for Nefer-ir-Kare's time on the throne, meaning that Nefer-ir-Kare's reign was at least 10 years, but no more than 11. A figure substantiated by 2 cursive inscriptions left by masons on stone blocks from the pyramids of Khentkhous II and Nefer-ir-Kare, both of which also date to Nefer-ir-Kare's 5th cattle count. After his death, as with the other pharaohs of the 5th dynasty, Nefer-ir-Kare benefited from a funerary cult taking place in his mortuary temple, which had been completed by his son Nusra-Ini. Some of the officials of this cult had roles in the cults of several kings as well as in their sun temples, with offerings for the funerary cult of deceased rulers provided by dedicated agricultural estates set up during the king's reign. The cult seems to have disappeared at the end of the Old Kingdom period, and traces of the continued existence of the funerary cult of Nefer-ir-Kare beyond the Old Kingdom period are scant, although a pair of statues, belonging to a certain Sekhemhotep, were uncovered in Giza dating to the early 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, being the only archaeological evidence that Nefer-ir-Kare's funerary cult still existed or had been revived around Abu Sir at the time. Nefer-ir-Kare Karkai was most likely succeeded by Prince Ra-Nefer-B, his eldest son to Queen Khentkhous II, who, as the 5th ruler of the 5th dynasty, took the throne name of Neferhefreasi. the eldest son of Neferkari Kakai to Queen Khentkaus II, Neferefre succeeded Neferkari Kakai to become the fifth ruler of the 5th dynasty. Neferefre's name is present on several New Kingdom king lists, the Abydos king list, the Saqqara tablet, and, in all probability, was also on the Turin canon, but it has since been lost in a large lacuna, or gap, affecting the document. Neferefre was married to Khentkaus III, who was most likely his full sister, at the very least his half-sister, and they had a son Menkau Horkeu. 2 further sons of Neferefre and Khentkaus III have been proposed, the king's son Nakhtsari, whose proposition as a son is supported by the general date and location of his tomb, and Kharkaibaf, a member of the elite buried in Abu Sir. Little is known of Neferefre's activities. Archaeologically, there is very little contemporaneous evidence relating to Neferefre, implying he had a very short reign. As of 2017, a few artifacts such as clay seals bearing his Horus name, dating to Neferefre's rule or shortly after, have been uncovered in his mortuary complex and elsewhere in Abu Sir, but only one inscription is known that dates to his rule, an inscription left by the builders of his pyramid on a corner block at the end of the corridor leading to the pyramid substructures. Written on the 4th day of the Akhat season in the year of first occurrence of the cattle count, the inscription must refer to Neferefre's 1st or 2nd year on the throne, his 3rd year at the very latest. Some of the Abu Sir papyri discovered in the temple of Khentkaus II, that dates to the mid to late 5th dynasty, mentions Neferefre's mortuary temple and funerary cult, not only confirming the existence of Neferefre's pyramid complex at a time when it had not yet been identified, but also gives details regarding the administrative organization and importance of the funerary cult of the king in ancient Egyptian society. Following the tradition established by Userkaf at the beginning of the dynasty, Neferefre either planned or built a sun temple to Ra, calling it Hotep Ra, meaning Ra is content, or Ra's offering table. Its existence is known solely from 4 inscriptions discovered in North Saqqara in the Mastaba of Ti, an administration official in the pyramid and sun temples of Saru Re, Nefer-ir-Kare, and Nusra.
So where is it? No doubt buried or destroyed by some massive fluvial catastrophe.
Given Neferefre's very short reign, it is possible that the temple might never have been completed, but an archaeological expedition in 1905 uncovered the ruins of large buildings of mud bricks beneath the Sun Temple of Nusra in Abu Ghurab, and it is possible that these are the remains of the Sun Temple of Neferefre, although in the absence of inscriptions confirming this identification, it remains conjectural.
What it does tell us is that there was some major event that caused lots of damage.
When he ascended the throne, Neferefre faced the task of completing his father's pyramid, the largest built during the 5th dynasty. Although well underway at the death of Nefer-ir-Kare, the pyramid was lacking its external limestone cladding, and the accompanying mortuary temple still had to be built. Neferefre thus started to cover the pyramid's surface with limestone and build the foundation of a stone temple on the pyramid's eastern side. His plans were cut short by his death, and the duty of finishing the monument fell on the shoulders of his successor and brother, Nusra, who abandoned the task of covering the pyramid face and instead concentrated on building the mortuary temple in bricks and wood.
Look at the building materials. Mud brick and wood. Not massive limestone blocks, not red granite. Isn't it just as plausible? Possibly more so. They weren't trying to build a pyramid. They were trying to repair and rebuild a pyramid.
At the same time, Neferefre started his own pyramid at Abu Sir, where his father and grandfather had built their pyramids, Korlinjit, Net Jerbau, Rar Neferhef, which means the pyramid which is divine of the Bar spirits. Divine is Neferefre's power. With a base of around 65 meters, it was planned to be larger than those of Userkaf and Saru-Re, but smaller than that of his father, Nefer-ir-Kare. But the pyramid was never finished. A mason's inscription showing work on the stone structure was abandoned during or shortly after the king's second year of reign.
But was it abandoned? What if it was only ever a mastaba?
About 7 meters high, the shape of the tomb of Neferhefre, as well as a number of other archaeological finds, was square and not rectangular, nor was it north-south oriented like mastabas, so it is believed to have been conceived as a pyramid, but that the construction of the king's funerary monument was interrupted, owing to the unexpected early death of the king. The plan of the unfinished building had to be basically changed, and according to a number of early explorers who had attributed Neferhefre's pyramid to his successor, Shepses-Karaesi, a decision was taken to hastily convert the unfinished pyramid, of which only the incomplete lowest step of the core was built, into a square-shaped mastaba.
As it may have been intended all along.
The outer face of the first step of the pyramid's core comprised a retaining wall 7 meters high made of huge blocks of dark grey limestone, some up to 5 meters long, bound together with clay. A second, inner wall, built of smaller blocks, made up the walls of the rectangular trench of the substructure of the tomb. Between these two walls there were no accretion layers. Rather, the new king, his brother Nusra, hastily completed the monument by filling its central part with pieces of small, poor-quality limestone, sometimes stuck together with clay mortar and sand, sometimes packed dry, alongside little compartments of rough stone lumps filled with rubble such as fragments of mud bricks and potsherds.
To me, the evidence is clear. The first part of the superstructure constructed was the inner wall that surrounded the trench of the tomb, which meant the trench must have preceded it. And that's where I'm sure we'll find the real evidence.
The first step of the core, then resembling a truncated pyramid, the outer surface was then faced with a smooth and nearly vertical covering of grey limestone at an angle of 78 degrees to the ground, and thus what had been planned as a pyramid became an atypically square mastaba.
No, I think they have it the wrong way round. It sounds like a repair job to me. The way I figure it, at some later stage, after they had surrounded the trench, it was obviously decided to build a mastaba to encase the tomb, preparing the ground, but then they changed their mind from building a mastaba to building a step pyramid, much as had been done at Saqqara with the step pyramid of Nefertiti, using whatever rubble was lying around to fill in the first step. However, for some reason, they either aborted the project after the first level, or the upper layers were swept away by a tsunami and it was repaired much later.
Finally, the roof terrace was covered with clay into which local desert gravels were pressed, giving it the appearance of a mound in the surrounding desert, and indeed it was by the name, the mound, that the monument was subsequently called by the ancient Egyptians.
Again, that sounds like a repair job to me, using the best techniques that are available on a much older and severely damaged structure.
The entrance passage, from the north, is a ditch dug down deep to intersect the trench, lined in the lower regions with pink granite, that curves slightly to the southeast as it descends towards the antechamber.
Granite. That tells me that the whole structure predates Neferefra and possibly the whole dynastic period. But why does the descending passage have a curve in it? That baffles me. It looks like there's been some sort of change of mind during the construction, and it was decided to intersect the trench at the antechamber rather than at the burial chamber. But why?
In the middle of the prepared base, a rectangular trench, east-west in orientation, was dug down into the bedrock to house the royal tomb and antechamber.
It's hardly a coincidence that so many of these so-called unfinished pyramids, Abu Rawash, the unfinished pyramid at Zoyet El Aryan, and the pyramid of Userkaf, have the same subterranean floor plan and structure, and that raises even more questions. But we will leave them and the exploration of the subterranean layout until we get to Abu Sir later in the series. Although the evidence we have so far concerning the similarity of this structure to the ones at Abu Rawash, Zoyet el Arian and the Pyramid of Userkaf, and that none of them were intended to be pyramids, confirms that these pyramids were probably built way before the first dynasty. The questions then becoming, by whom, when, and why?
Neferhefre was nonetheless buried in his pyramid by his presumably younger brother, Pharaoh Nusra-Ini.
Or is he? We don't know. There's no actual evidence his mummy wasn't found there, and there is no proof his brother buried him there. Tradition says he would have been buried by his successor, the mysterious Shepseskare. It's simply more speculation and what I call polyphiller archaeology by the Egyptologists.
At the moment of the king's death, neither Neferhefre's burial apartment had been built, nor had the foundation of the mortuary temple been laid. However, in the short 70-day period allowed between a king's death and his burial, Neferhefre's successor, most probably Shepseskare, built a small limestone chapel on the base platform of his planned pyramid.
Again, there's no proof of this. It's purely speculation.
On a 5-meter wide part of the pyramid's base, originally created by 2 layers of huge limestone blocks intended as foundation for the pyramid's smooth limestone casing, is a very small mortuary temple, with a north-south axis, constructed of small blocks of fine white limestone and entered by a stairway and ramp from the southeast.
There are several things about that quote that instantly strike me. Firstly, that the site of the structure must have been levelled first, just like with the blocks added at Abu Rawash. Second, that the base of the pyramid had possibly been a rectangle, which would be consistent with it being planned as a mastaba. Third, that there was a smaller temple built first, possibly belonging to Neferhefre's successor, Shepseskare Isi.
It's uncertain who built this small chapel, but it was completed during Nusra's reign, with Nusra also building a larger mortuary temple for Neferhefre, extending over the whole 65-meter length of the proposed pyramid side, but built of cheaper mud brick.
Again, built or repaired, because that's as far as their technical knowledge permitted them to go. And just because the mortuary temple is along the eastern face of the pyramid doesn't mean that the temple and the pyramid, or mastaba it was built in front of, were contemporary with one another.
The temple entrance comprised a courtyard adorned with 2 stone and 24 wooden columns.
Wood? Again, it doesn't ring true as being consistent with the technology required to quarry and move massive pieces of red granite.
Following that was the earliest hypostyle hall of ancient Egypt, the remains of which can still be detected, its roof supported by wooden columns in the shape of lotus clusters resting on limestone bases.
Surely that one piece of evidence rules out the possibility that the pyramid was built by Neferhefre. Expanded perhaps, possibly even repaired. But was he responsible for the original subterranean structures? Highly unlikely.
There is an apparent depression in the floor in the western wall of the offering hall, supposedly marking the spot where an altar once stood.
Was it made of red granite? Limestone perhaps? No one knows.
The small temple was extended to the north by a group of 10 2-story storage magazines for offerings and the papyri of the priesthood, in which were discovered in and around the hall fragments of statues of Neferhefre made of diorite, basalt, limestone, reddish quartzite, and wood, including 6 relatively complete, though mostly broken statues, the most beautiful of these, as well as the smallest at about 35 centimeters, being an incomplete rose-colored limestone statue, in fragments, depicting the young pharaoh sitting on a throne and holding a hedge, the emblem of royal power, to his chest. And in 1982, a significant cache of administrative papyri.
It seems pretty obvious to me that Neferefre's small temple was most likely extended and modified by one of his successors, Shepseskare or Nusra, into a larger rectangular temple made almost entirely of mud brick that stretched along the whole eastern side of the unfinished pyramid.
Extensions to the south of the temple reveal an east-west oriented hypostyle hall with 20 wooden 6-stemmed lotus columns in 4 rows of 5, which supported a flat wooden ceiling at a height of about 4 meters.
So the king builds in wooden columns, not limestone and not granite. Does that indicate that all of the ancient red granite columns had been usurped, or that wooden columns were the norm for this period, or both?
In the 1970s, the University of Prague did a systematic investigation using geophysical surveying, specifically with magnetometry, of the ground in front of the eastern wall of the structure. The tests revealed a huge, highly articulated building of mud bricks in the shape of the letter T, a shape characteristic of mortuary temples in the 5th and 6th dynasty. From this, by piecing together various clues, they arrived at the conclusion that it was indeed Neferefre's pyramid.
The temple perhaps, but not the pyramid. Just because you find a few rolls of toilet paper in the outdoor dunny doesn't mean that the mansion was built by Sorbent. But wait, there's more.
In 2014, the mastaba of Neferefre's wife, Queen Khentkhous III, presumably buried during the few decades following Neferefre's reign, was discovered in close proximity, southeast of Neferefre's pyramid. The location and date of the tomb, as well as inscriptions found in it of the king's wife, strongly supporting that Khentkhous III was Neferefre's queen. In addition, other inscriptions in her tomb indicate Khentkhous III was also called King's Mother, indicating that her son had also become pharaoh. While Neferefre is given a reign of some 20 years by many, though, the current academic view is that this number is an overestimation of his true reign length, which must have been significantly shorter. Based on archaeological evidence, the unfinished state of his intended pyramid, and the general paucity of documents datable to his rule, his reign is now thought to be no more than 2 years.
Are they playing around with the dates just to make the speculations about their building of the pyramids plausible? Sounds that way to me.
Furthermore, 2 historical sources conform with the hypothesis of a short reign: the Mason's inscription in Neferefre's pyramid and the Turin canon, which credits Neferefre with less than 2 full years of reign. The combination of archaeological and historical evidence led to the consensus that Neferefre's reign lasted not longer than about 2 years.
Which raises major issues about him building anything.
After his death, Neferefre might have been succeeded by a similarly short-lived and little-known pharaoh, Shepseskare, whose relation with Neferefre remains highly uncertain and debated.
And we will get to that presently, but first let's finish with Neferefre.
Fragments of mummy wrappings and death masks, as well as scattered pieces of human remains, were discovered on the east side of the burial chamber of the pyramid: a left clavicle still covered with skin, a left hand, fragments of skin probably from the forehead, upper eyelid and the left foot, and a few bones. These remains were in the same archaeological layer as broken pieces from a red granite sarcophagus, as well as what remained of the funerary equipment of the king, hinting that they could indeed belong to Neferefre.
Or they could belong to anyone. And how you could discern the age of the deceased from those remains is beyond me. Possibly from the bones. And the presence of fragments of a red granite sarcophagus does not mean it was a sarcophagus, or that anyone was inside it, or if someone was, that it was Neferefre.
Subsequent studies of the embalming techniques used on the mummy corroborated it was compatible with an Old Kingdom date.
And it may have been Neferefre, but it could have been anyone.
The body of the king was probably dried by means of natron and then covered with a thin layer of resin before being given a white calcareous coating. A final confirmation of the identity of the mummy is provided by radiocarbon dating, which yielded a 2628 to 2393 BC interval for the human remains in close correspondence with estimated dates for the 5th dynasty.
Or with anyone in the 4th and 5th dynasty. The radiocarbon dating is speculative evidence. That it is Neferefre is 100% speculation.
Thus, Neferefre is, with Djedkare Assesi, one of the very few Old Kingdom pharaohs whose mummy has been identified.
No, they are doing it again, saying that it has been identified when in fact it has not been identified.
A bioarchaeological analysis of Neferefre's remains revealed that the king did not partake in strenuous work, died in his early 20s at between 20 and 23 years old, and that he may have stood 1.67 to 1.69 meters in height. The remains of a second individual were discovered in the burial chamber, but those proved to belong to an individual from the late Middle Ages, who likely lived during the 14th century AD. He had simply been laid on rags and covered with sand for his burial.
It sort of proves my point. The Egyptologists claim the remains do belong to Neferefre, but the bioarchaeological analysis evidence says nothing about that at all. It's not as if they've done a DNA analysis and compared it to his mother.
Like other 5th dynasty kings, Neferefre benefited from a funerary cult established at his death that took place in a temple built by Nusra next to the former's pyramid. Some of the details of this cult have survived in the Abu Sir papyri, including a 10-day festival held every year in his honor, during which, on at least one occasion, no less than 130 bulls were sacrificed in the slaughterhouse of his mortuary temple. The main benefactors of these sacrifices were the cult's priests, who consumed the offerings after the required ceremonies. However, the funerary cult of Neferefre seems to have ceased or been abandoned around the end of the Old Kingdom, and Neferefre fell into obscurity.
Again, was this because of some catastrophe towards the end of the 6th dynasty? Our examination of the first part of the 5th dynasty would tend to show that rather than the pyramids and structures being built in the 5th dynasty, there is evidence that they may have been rebuilt or repaired and therefore were built much earlier. But this is only the first part of our examination. Join me in the second part of this episode as we look at the second half of the 5th dynasty.